Good morning and welcome to Pacific Union. This morning we will be worshiping around the theme of the last fruit of the Spirit, which is self-control. And if you think about self-control, the root of self-control or the fuel of self-control is hope. Without hope, there is no self-control. And that's what Psalm 16 is all about. So what we want you to do as we prepare for worship this morning is take some time to read through Psalm 16 slowly and meditate on the themes of hope, particularly the hope that we see in God that is brought out in this psalm. And then offer your own prayer that you will believe this hope so that it changes the way you live, so that you might live a life of self-control.
Jesus, all for Jesus, all I am and have, and ever hope to be. Jesus, all for Jesus. To be, for it's only in your will that I am free, for it's only in your will that I am free. Hopes and plans, I surrender. it's only in your will that I am free. Jesus, all for Jesus, all I am and have and ever hope to be. All I am and have and ever hope to be. Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart. Not be all else to me, save that thou art. Thou my best thought, by day or by night, waking or sleeping, thy presence my life. Be thou my wisdom, and thou my true word. I ever with thee, and thou with me, Lord. Thou my great Father, and I thy true Son. Thou in me dwelling, and I with thee one. Riches I heed not, nor man's empty praise. Thou my inheritance, now and always. Thou and thou only, first in my heart. High King of heaven, my treasure thou art. High King of heaven, my victory won. May I reach heaven's shores, oh bright heaven's sun. Heart of my own heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, O ruler of all. Heart of my own heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, O ruler of all. What gift of grace is Jesus my Redeemer? There is no more for heaven now to give. He is my joy, my righteousness and freedom, my steadfast love, my deep and boundless peace. To this I hold, my hope is only Jesus, for my life is wholly bound to His. Oh, how strange and divine, I can sing all is mine, yet not I, but through Christ in me. The night is dark, but I am not forsaken, for by my side the Savior, He will stay. I labor on in weakness and rejoicing, for in my need His power is displayed. To this I hold, my shepherd will defend me. Through the deepest valley He will lead. Oh, the night has been won, and I shall overcome, yet not I, but through Christ in me. No fate I dread, I know I am forgiven. The future sure, the price it has been paid. For Jesus bled and suffered for my pardon, and He was raised to overthrow the grave. To this I hold, my sin has been defeated. Jesus now and ever is my plea. Oh, the chains are released, I can sing, I am free, and not I, but through Christ in me. With every breath, I long to follow Jesus, for He has said that He will bring me home. And day by day, I know He will renew me, until I stand with joy before the throne. To this I hold, my hope is only Jesus. All the glory evermore to Him. When the race is complete, still my lips shall repeat, yet not I, but through Christ in me. To this I hold, my hope is only Jesus. All the glory evermore to Him. When the race is complete, still my lips shall repeat, yet not I, but through Christ in me. When the race is complete, still my lips shall repeat, yet not I, but through Christ in me. Yet not I, but through Christ in me. Yet not I, but through Christ in me.
Good morning. This morning's reading comes from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last. But we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer, beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize.
Good morning, you guys, and welcome back. So today, I've decided that I've set a new goal for myself. I want to run a marathon. And I don't just want to run a marathon, I want to win a marathon. So, you know what a marathon is? A marathon, that's right, a marathon is a really long race. It goes for more than 26 miles. So, let me tell you, this is my strategy, and you tell me if this is going to work. I am going to do absolutely nothing. I'm just going to wait for race day, and when race day gets there, I'm going to stand in the starting line, and just as Disney tells you, I'm going to dream really hard, and then I'm going to try really hard, and I'm going to try to win. What do you guys think? Do I have a chance? No? You don't think so? What's that? I have to get ready? I have to get in shape? Huh. So how am I going to get in shape? Oh, I know. I brought this alarm clock. A lot of runners, I think, they wake up really early in the morning and they go running before they start the rest of their day. So what happens if I do this? So tomorrow morning I'm going to get up and I'm going to run 4 miles in the morning. And then the alarm clock goes off. And every time the alarm goes off, I go like this. And I hit the snooze button. And I hit the snooze button again. Is that going to work? No, because I won't wake up and I won't practice. Do you know what you need in order to become a really good runner? You need to have self-control. Do you know what self-control is? Self-control is when you do what your body doesn't want to do, or you don't do what your body really wants to do. So in the morning, when the alarm clock goes off, self-control says, I know my body wants to sleep. I know my body wants to hit the snooze bar so I can keep sleeping. But because I want to win, I'm going to get up and I'm going to run and I'm going to practice. All right, here's another example of self-control. Let's say I start running and I finally do get up and I leave my house and I start running down the road, and the first time I feel tired or feel sore, I just give up. My body wants to give up, so I just stop. Am I going to get into shape so I can run a marathon? No, because I need self-control. Even though my body wants to stop, I have to keep going. That's how I get stronger. That's how I can run longer. That's how I can have a shot at winning. It takes self-control. Here's another thing. I absolutely love Teddy Grahams. These are chocolate Teddy Grahams, double chocolate Teddy Grahams. What would happen if every time I walk by these Teddy Grahams, while I'm getting ready to run a marathon, I have a whole handful of these? So I eat 50 pounds of these a day. Is that going to help me win? Well, my body does want to eat 50 pounds a day, but self-control says I want to win, so I have to watch what I eat. So sometimes when you want to win a prize, self-control is really important. We have to do things or not do things that we really want to do. Did you know that when in Jesus' day they had races, and in those days they won a prize? They won a crown made out of pine leaves, but that crown didn't last very long. But runners did all sorts of things. They got up really early. They didn't eat food they shouldn't eat. They practiced really hard even when it hurt, just so they could have a chance to win. A prize that didn't last. But you know that Jesus has a prize for us that lasts forever? That's why self-control is really important. In order to get that prize, we have to say no to things that we really want to do and say yes to things that we really don't want to do. So, do you know what that prize is? Well, you'll have to go downstairs to find out. Oh, wait, we can't because we're not at church. But you can find out with your family. If you go to pacificunionchurch.org/church small, you'll find a link to the Family Challenge discussion guide, or you'll find a link to it in the description of this video. So follow the questions that are there, do the activities that you see there, and find out what prize God has for us that lasts forever, and how we can show self-control in our own life and show that fruit of the Spirit. So find out what it is, put it into practice, and we'll see you guys next week. Take care, and God bless. So as I was preparing for this sermon, and I was reading through 1 Corinthians 9, I realized that the Greeks and the ancient Corinthians, the people that Paul is writing to, are probably just as crazy about sports as we are. Right there in the city of Corinth, which was kind of in the central part of Greece, they had these things called the Isthmian Games, which was like the Olympics, but it happened every 2 years. They had all sorts of contests. They had chariot races and foot races and wrestling matches, boxing matches, and even singing contests. They actually thought that singing was a sport. And people from all over Greece came, and they were so passionate. The fans would scream and yell, and it was just a huge festival that lasted all week. In fact, it was so important that when the cities were fighting against each other, they actually put a temporary stop to the war so they could come together and compete against each other on the athletic field. That was the Isthmian Games. And they would come together and compete. And the one thing that Paul has in mind, he actually has two, is one is the running and the other is boxing. And these runners would come together, run about 1/8 of a mile, so it was sort of in between a sprint and a little bit more long distance. And the winner would get this. The winner got a crown of pine needles. No cash, just a crown of pine needles and the roaring of the crowd. And these runners would dedicate their whole lives to winning this one race. Just to say that they were at the Isthmian Games and they won gold and they won that wreath of pine leaves. It took an incredible amount of self-control in order to get into shape. These guys, when they ran, they oriented their entire life around this. This is how Paul describes it. If you look down at verse 25 of chapter 9, he says, "Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training." Now that's interesting. Well, first of all, the word for one who participates in the game or athlete in some of your translation, the word is the same root word as agony. Meaning that these people went through agony in order to compete. And it says, the NIV says that they went through strict training. And another way to translate that is that they exercised self-control in all areas of their life. Every decision that they made, everything they decided to do or not do was made in light of the idea that, will this help me or will this hurt me win in the games this next year? So they went on strict diets. They pushed their bodies to the limit when they exercised. They chose not to party as much so that they could be in better shape. Every decision they made, even though their body wanted to do something completely different, but they thought about the chance of standing on that podium, wearing that crown that only lasted a couple of weeks. But they were willing to sacrifice and say no to themselves in order just to have a shot to be one of the few competitors, the one person who would win that race. It meant the world to them. And so they exercised an incredible amount of self-control, not eating foods that they wanted to eat, pushing their bodies when their bodies wanted to give up, saying no to partying in certain cases so that they could be in the kind of shape that they needed so that they could win. Every decision was made so they could win, even if their body wanted to do the opposite thing. It was self-control in all aspects of everything. So Paul takes this image that every Corinthian knew, because everyone receiving that letter and reading that letter and hearing that letter read aloud in their church had been to those games. This was like their Super Bowl, their World Series, their NBA Finals. This was the pinnacle of sports, and they were passionate about their sports. And they all knew, and they all remembered those athletes, and they remembered how dedicated and how self-controlled they were. And then he turns the image back on them. Look at how the end of verse 25 ends. He says this. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, the crown of pine needles. But we do it to get a crown that will last forever. The point Paul is making is this. We have this the fruit of the Spirit, this self-control. And we see incredible self-control in athletes who are going after a prize and going after adulation that will only last for a moment. And yet they reorient their entire lives around this. They say no to themselves. They push themselves when they don't want to keep going because they might get a temporary prize. How much more should we, if the prize that God offers to us is forever and eternal? In fact, the word there is imperishable, and which is kind of the same thing, but I wanted to bring out that idea of imperishable because that word is incredibly important in 1 Corinthians. When Paul gets to the climax of this letter to the church in Corinth in chapter 15, he talks about resurrection. And that word imperishable shows up time and time and time again. I want to read that passage for you because because it's familiar, and two, because it talks about this eternal, this imperishable prize that God holds out for us. This is something that I've read multiple times at funerals, and you probably will recognize it. He says this in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 51. Listen, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will be changed in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable. And we will be changed. For the perishable, that is our bodies as it exists now, must clothe itself with the imperishable, that is our new bodies, and the mortal with immortality. And when the perishable has been clothed with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality, then the saying that is written will come true. Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? The root of self-control is hope. And if the Greek runners and the Greek athletes could dedicate their whole lives to an outside hope that they would be the one person to win that temporary prize, how much more we, if God holds out to us an imperishable prize, a new body, perfect and sinless, living forever in the presence of God, in a new heaven and a new earth. If that hope is real, how much more should we live self-controlled, disciplined lives in the present? You see, without hope, there is no reason to exercise self-control. But if there is hope, if there is new life and at the end of our finish line, if there is a new body at the end of our lives, if there is a new world, if there's a new life where we live in the presence of God at the end of all things, and if we believe that to be true, should we not run? Should we not go at it with the same passion that an Olympic runner dedicates their whole life going after a gold medal, just having that outside shot? We have the sure thing because Christ lived and died for us so that we already have the victory. And now this victory is offered to us, and God says to us, run, run. Do things your body does not want to do. Say yes to things that it doesn't want to do. Say no to the things that it wants to do so that you might dedicate your life to running this race we call the Christian life. Now, this raises a really interesting question, and this is something that came up in our Panera discussion this past week. what is all this talk about effort and running? If salvation is a gift of God, it's all about what Christ has done for us, the fact that he lived the life that we should have lived and died the death we should have died and was raised from the dead so that we could live forever with God. If it's all Jesus and none of us, what's all this talk about effort? It doesn't seem to make sense. Rather than saying Christianity is a race, why don't we just say let go and let God? Why don't we just chill? Because God does everything for us. Well, it does sound like a contradiction, and there definitely is a tension there. But I want to say that this all makes sense when you think about two words, faith and love. Let me unpack faith first. Let me bring you to the beginning of this letter. So the book of Corinthians is actually a letter from the Apostle Paul to the church in Corinth, which is an actual city in the center of Greece, which exists even to this day, and you can find the ruins of the old city still existing now. And he writes this. I want you to hear how in verse 2, as he addresses this church and as he greets them, notice what he says about them. There is something that has already happened to them in the past, and there is something that they're called to do in the present. Listen for those two things. To the church of God in Corinth, to those sanctified in Christ Jesus and called to be holy. So let's take a look at the thing that he said has already happened because of Christ or in Christ Jesus. It says that we have been sanctified. Well, what does that even mean? Well, the word to sanctify simply means to make holy. That means that God, through Jesus Christ, through what he has done, has made you holy. That is past tense, that is already true, that is right here, right now, that has been accomplished. But notice what Paul is saying. You have been made holy by God. Now you are called to live a holy life. That's the rhythm of grace that you see all over the New Testament, and especially in the writings of Paul. He will say, here is who you are. Then he says, now be who you are. That is what the Christian life is all about living out what Christ has already made us to be. So for instance, you are holy. I've already made you holy through Jesus Christ. Now live a holy life. I'm calling you to live that way. You have been forgiven. Now live as a forgiven person, not only allowing yourself to live free, but also to freely give forgiveness to others. You have been adopted into God's family. Now live as a child of God by imitating Jesus Christ. Do you see the rhythm? This is who you are. This is who I've made you by grace. Believe it by faith and now become who you are. Become what I've already made you. You have received the gift of faith from God. Now live by faith. I have given you this incredible prize at the end of the finish line. You will have a new, restored, perfect, whole, undying body that will enjoy God forever. Now run the race, because that is what's waiting for you at the finish line. We run this race because we believe God's promises are true and that he always keeps his promises. The Greeks ran because they had an outside hope that they might be the one person to get a temporary prize. We run because we have a sure hope that we will all receive the prize because Christ has won the victory for us. We run because we run by faith. So how do we exercise self-control? And how does faith kind of play into this picture? A runner will watch what he eats and make sure that even when he's tired, he's going to push his body to keep running and to keep practicing. What does it look like in the Christian life? Well, what's interesting is that this image of the Christian life being a race is all throughout the New Testament. Paul talks about it here in Corinthians, and the writer of Hebrews talks about it in Hebrews chapter 12. I want to read this for a moment because he's using the same image of the games. So there's a race that's going on. It's a foot race. the crowds are there, but in this case, the crowds that are people in the stands are the saints, the followers of Jesus Christ, God's people who have lived before us and who are now in the presence of God. And they're cheering us on as we run our own race. And notice what he says. This is how he described the Christian life. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, here's what self-control looks like. Let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. So let me tell you that the runners in the ancient Greek world took this idea of throwing off everything that hinders you completely literally. They ran naked. I mean, can you imagine, you ever seen the togas and the long Greek robes? Can you imagine trying to run a sprint with those things on? You would trip every 3 steps. They actually ran naked. They didn't have tracksuits, but they took off everything that got in the way, anything that would slow them down, and they ran that race with everything they had. And the writer of Hebrews is saying to us, you do the same thing. Throw off sin. Say no to it. Exercise self-control. Well, what does that mean? We had a really interesting conversation with the Panera group, and somebody pointed out that whatever that sin is or sins that might hold us back are probably different from each one of us. So I'm just going to take a couple as an example, but I want you to think about your own life, because these might not be your things that trip you up. It might be something else. But all of us have a particular sin. Let's say it's greed, that we build our life around monetary gain and the accumulation of wealth. And that can be dangerous. And it's not that God doesn't bless us and he gives us what we need and provides, and sometimes gives us more than what we need. But the danger is that behind every sin there is an idol. And what an idol is a false god that is offering us a temporary reward in exchange for God's eternal promises. And so if we're not careful and the pursuit of money becomes the center of our life, it can shut out the promises of heaven so that we live a self-controlled life, not in the pursuit of ending the Christian life at the finish line and entering the heaven and entering the presence of God. We could actually live a self-controlled life in the service of accumulating wealth. I think this is what Jesus was talking about in Mark 9:36, which was part of the readings from the Connect this past week. He says, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and he loses his very soul? The danger, the thing that will trip us up when we run is sin. Sin offered by these false gods of temporary, immediate pleasure and relief in exchange for God's eternal promises. And self-control, these are the things that our body wants. And self-control says no, because I have a greater purpose. I have a race to run. I have a race to win. There's Christ waiting for me at the finish line. There is eternal life waiting for me at the finish line. It's worth it to say no in this moment. How do we fight this? How do we exercise self-control? What does this even look like? Well, I like how Paul describes it, because now he's going to bring in not only running, but also boxing. He says this in verse 26. Therefore, I do not run like a man running aimlessly. So there's that running part. He runs with purpose. But I do not fight like a man beating the air. This is not an unskilled boxer who just goes into the ring and starts swinging wildly. He fights tactically. He fights strategically. He fights smartly. He says, no, I beat my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I will not be disqualified for the prize. That word, to beat my body, it actually means to punch below the eye or to give someone a black eye. If you've ever watched a boxer fight tactically, that's the place where they want to land the punch, is right below the eye. They want to cause a black eye. They want to blur the vision of the other boxer. And he says, that's how we fight sin. But we're not fighting someone else. We're actually fighting ourselves. So let's say my core sin is greed, and I'm fighting. What does it mean to box and to give myself a black eye? And what does it mean to fight strategically against that core sin of building my life around amassing monetary wealth? What does it look like? Well, I think Jesus called us to practice the opposite virtue. So if money runs your life, give it away. Because the opposite of greed is generosity. What if your life is around building, having accomplishments? And what if your life is built around achievements? Well, why don't you practice the opposite? Why don't you start practicing Sabbath rest? Why don't you start practicing stillness and sitting quietly in the presence of God? I guarantee you it'll be hard because your body will be screaming to get up and do something because it can't imagine itself apart from its accomplishment. It can't imagine its identity apart from its job. But we punch and we fight back by practicing the opposite. Why? Because we believe that if we run this race, that if we fight, we will win because Christ is waiting for us at the finish line. And his prize of a new body, a sinless body, is there. And this race is worth running for. Oh, if lust is my core sin, why not practice the gift, the opposite virtue of sacrificial love? It'll be the opposite of want because lust wants to use the other to fill the hole in themselves. But if we're filled by God, we can do the opposite. We can actually sacrifice ourselves for the sake of the other. We fight strategically. We don't just swing wildly. We just don't do crazy things. We actually think, God, reveal to me what my core sins are and give me the strength and this courage to practice the opposite virtue. And we do this because we believe that the race that Christ has mapped out for us is a race worth running because his promises are sure and he has already made us victorious. We run like winners because Christ has already made us winners, because he has lived the life we should have lived. He has run the race we should have lived. He has died the death for our failures and he's been raised from the dead. And so when we finish the race, we will be raised to life as well. That's running by faith. It's about fighting yourself because I don't want to be disqualified. I don't want to accept a temporary prize in exchange for the eternal promises of God. By faith, we smash our idols because the hope that comes from faith is the fuel that energizes and moves us to live a self-controlled life. But there's also love. This whole section of 1 Corinthians 9, 24 through 27 is part of a large section that actually begins at the beginning of chapter 8 in 1 Corinthians and ends at the end of chapter 10. And it's all about freedom and the use of freedom. The chapter 8 begins with a controversy that had racked the church in Corinth. It's not something that we face today, but I think you can see the principle. So back in Corinth, they had pagan temples all throughout the city where sacrifices were offered day after day after day. And then the meat from those sacrifices were offered for sale to the public. So you went to a pagan temple to buy meat like you would go to a butcher shop. But then as people stopped being followers of the Greek gods and became followers of Jesus Christ, they had a really difficult question. Do we still go to the pagan temple? Do we still eat these meats that have been sacrificed to idols, or should we not? And there was a controversy. Some Christians said, yes, we should do it. And others said, no, we can't do it. We can't have anything to do with the old religion. And Paul makes the point that we worship one God, and he is the only God that exists, which means that the Greek gods don't exist at all. Which means that we are free to eat meat to sacrifice to idols. We don't have to worry about it. And but just before we run out and exercise our freedom, Paul says this, but not everybody knows this. And if you eat meat sacrificed to idol and it offends your weaker brother who doesn't know as much as you, if it trips them up as they're trying to run the Christian race, then it's not love. You know what we're called to do? We're free to do all sorts of things because we belong to Jesus Christ. But in love, we exercise self-control and we allow ourselves to be enslaved and we give up our freedoms for the sake of others so that they can run their race without our freedom tripping them up. If you look through chapter 8 and 9 and into chapter 10, you'll discover that Paul gave up all sorts of freedoms, said no to himself, exercised extraordinary self-control in the service of love. For example, when he came to Corinth, he had every right as an apostle and a preacher of the gospel to be paid by the church in Corinth. But because of the unique circumstances that were there, he knew that accepting a salary from them would present a barrier to them accepting the gospel. So he went without pay, even though he was entitled to it. Why? Because the gospel is worth sacrificing for. And out of love, wanting to see those Corinthians run the race and follow Jesus Christ with everything they had, he was willing to give up his rights for their sake. We also know that through Paul that we don't no longer have to follow the Jewish law. We don't have to eat, we don't have to stay away from certain foods. We don't have to get circumcised. We don't have to do any of those things. But Paul, when he was with Jewish people who still lived by the Jewish law, when he knew that when he didn't keep the Jewish law, it created an offense and they wouldn't be able to hear what he had to say and they wouldn't come to faith in Jesus Christ, he was willing to give up his freedom and resubmit himself to Jewish law so that his Jewish brothers and sisters could come to faith. You see, we exercise self-control not only because we believe in the promises of God, that there is eternal life at the end of this race. We also exercise self-control, giving up things that we're completely free to do for the sake of others so that they can run their own race. It's faith and love that says, oh, I have won because of Jesus Christ. This race is worth running. And the fact that I'm even a contestant in the race is an example of the love of God. How can I not extend that same love? How can I not sacrifice myself to see others run the race as well? So you're going to have a chance now to really think about these things. What's the core sins that you struggle with in your life? It might be greed, it might be lust, it might be the pursuit of wealth. It might be the pursuit of accomplishments, making your job your identity. It could be a whole bunch of things. It could be drugs. What promises of God has he held out for you? How will you believe in that perfect eternal prize? And how will that give you strength to fight and box against your sin nature and practice the opposite virtue? What would that opposite virtue be for you? What will you exercise by faith? What will you fight by faith in yourself? And also think about the freedom and the blessings that God has given you. How can you deny yourself? How can you exercise self-control so that others can run the race as well? Really give this some thought. This is a vital spiritual gift. They run for a temporary prize. We run for an eternal prize. They run with the outside chance they might win. We have a secure prize because of the love of God. How can we exercise self-control in our own life for the sake of ourselves? And how can we exercise self-control for the sake of others, for the sake of love? Give that some thought. Put that into practice and share what you're learning with others. And we'll see you guys here next week. Take care.